insomnia. The first sign that something in the narrator's life is terribly wrong is the overwhelming fatigue that clings to him like a persistent fog. Night after night, he lies awake in his nondescript condominium, surrounded by the sterile perfection of his curated furniture, the result of countless hours spent flipping through glossy catalogs. A faint ache at the back of his mind warns him that he is living in a cycle of meaningless repetition. He works, he buys things to fill his living space, and he tries to sleep, yet real rest never comes. Instead, his insomnia burrows deeper, making everything feel unreal. Under flickering fluorescent lights, or in the hush of his condo at midnight, he has the eerie sensation of drifting through life without genuinely participating in it. He sees doctors, hoping for a silver bullet solution. Each professional he meets dismisses his complaints, telling him he just needs more exercise or a balanced diet, bad advice that ignores the gnawing emptiness inside him. He attempts warm milk at bedtime, herbal teas, and even guided relaxation tapes. In fleeting moments, these remedies dull the edge of sleeplessness, but it always resurfaces. His eyes, bloodshot in the mirror, betray the toll that the nights of endless wakefulness are exacting on him. And still, day after day, he lugs himself to his office. Co-workers notice his lethargy and wandering attention, but no one seems particularly concerned. After all, everyone around him is trapped in their own corporate routine, wrapped up in mundane responsibilities. The emptiness in the narrator's personal life isn't strictly limited to his insomnia or the bleak hours spent at his job. He inhabits a space that is both physically and emotionally sterile. The condo, which he once took pride in decorating with the perfect coffee tables, rugs, and dish sets, has slowly turned into a display museum of consumer objects, things meant to define a lifestyle rather than foster any genuine comfort. The narrator is aware, on some level, that these carefully chosen items were supposed to reflect personal taste or status, but instead, they leave him feeling more disillusioned. It's as though each new purchase is supposed to fill the void where real human connection should reside. Eventually, one doctor, exasperated by the narrator's insistence that something deeper is wrong, makes a glib suggestion. If you want to see real suffering, he implies, go visit those living with terminal illnesses. On a whim, or perhaps out of sheer desperation, the narrator takes that half-sarcastic advice to heart. He attends a support group for men with testicular cancer, a place he can't possibly belong to, not by any medical metric. Yet, as he sits among individuals facing very real and imminent mortality, he finds something he never expected, an honest emotional release. The group's vulnerability, their raw authenticity as they confront pain, fear, and hope, offers him the catharsis that has been missing in his life. During his first meeting, he meets Big Bob, or Bob Paulson in some references, a former bodybuilder whose hormonal therapy has left him with an enlarged chest and a subdued presence. Bob's warm hug, despite the paradoxical sight of a muscular man crying openly about his condition, ends up liberating the narrator. After months of numbness, the narrator finds that in this group circle, he can let down his guard. When he surrenders to the collective outpouring of grief and desperation, he manages to cry, to feel something genuine. That night, for the first time in ages, he goes home and sleeps deeply. No tossing, no turning, no waking at 3 a.m. to stare blankly at the ceiling. The relief is remarkable. Emboldened by this success, the narrator begins to attend more of these groups. He doesn't limit himself to just the cancer survivors. He visits support circles for people with serious, life-threatening conditions of all kinds. The pattern is almost ritualistic. Arriving early, his own supposed condition, though occasionally he hints vaguely at issues to justify being there. Week after week, he soaks up the unfiltered emotion, letting other people's tragedies wash over him as he finds a strange secondhand release. With each meeting, his life outside these circles seems to fade further into the background. Work becomes perfunctory. He shows up, attends to spreadsheets and mind-numbing tasks, then daydreams about which support group he'll drop in on next. Even the once coveted furniture in his condo no longer catches his eye. Now, what truly matters is the sense of weightlessness, the near spiritual calm that envelops him after he's been in a room full of people unburdening their souls. Paradoxically, his own problems seem inconsequential, yet at the same time, he's better able to rest when he acknowledges real human pain, vicariously though it may be. However, it isn't long before this carefully orchestrated routine is disturbed. In one of the groups, he notices a woman, skinny, with dark hair, dressed in thrift store clothing, and smoking as if she doesn't care whether the group has rules against it. She calls herself Marla Singer. The narrator instantly recognizes that she, like him, is a tourist, someone who doesn't belong in these circles. Her presence scrapes against his nerves. Whenever he spots her, he can no longer cry. It's as if she's a mirror, reflecting back his own dishonesty, depriving him of the emotional freedom he has come to depend on. Marla is the living embodiment of everything he fears about himself. A lost soul who might be as desperate for real feeling as he is, but whose casual approach to lying and boundary crossing unsettles him. In her presence, the narrator's carefully constructed escape hatch, his nightly visits to groups that soothe his insomnia, threatens to come crashing down. He dreads confronting the fact that his sense of belonging in these circles is built on a lie. Just as he's about to experience that beautiful flood of tears, he'll see Marla lurking in the back of the room, smirking or staring off in her own world, and everything within him shuts down. He contemplates confronting her directly, maybe telling her to stay away, or negotiating which nights each of them can attend which support groups. In a twisted way, he feels a connection with her, an affinity that springs from their shared deception. She also appears restless, shifting her weight during the group confessions, snorting derisively at times, and occasionally locking eyes with him as though to say, "You and I are the same." That unspoken bond, laced with hostility, throws off the narrator's precarious balance. Now, all he wants is to preserve the singular relief he finds in these meetings. He craves sleep more desperately than anything else. Without it, reality quickly disintegrates into a haze. Increasingly, he wonders what, if anything, can replace the emotional purge he's been getting from these groups. He sees Marla as a threat to his newfound solution, and as a potential conspirator, someone who might blow his cover at any moment. The frustration and resentment build, fueling his anxiety. The rest of his life still feels empty and colorless, but this new problem demands attention. While his insomnia eases on some nights, when he can successfully avoid Marla, it resurfaces whenever she shows up, hooking the narrator back into a restless routine of misery and fatigue. Meanwhile, he can't entirely ignore the underlying question: why is she there? Surely, she must feel some version of the desperation that propelled him into these groups. Yet, she is brazen where he is discreet. She doesn't bother to hide her scorn for the group's sincerity, nor does she bother to conceal that she's as healthy as he is. She seems to glide in and out with a bemused detachment, collecting something intangible from these sessions. In a sense, they are two halves of the same broken mirror, each reflecting a different facet of the same aimless, existential discontent, And so the narrator's insomnia continues, though he has momentary windows of relief. On some nights, he manages to avoid her or finds a group she hasn't infiltrated yet, and then he can lose himself in the heartfelt stories and tears that allow him to cry in a stranger's arms. On the nights Marla shows up, his mind buzzes with paranoia and frustration. He leaves the meeting tense, lying awake in bed until dawn, fixating on the possibility that his secret, and thus his only shot at peace, has been compromised. By the close of this chapter in his life, everything hinges on the delicate balance between escaping Marla Singer's gaze and plunging fully into the raw honesty of the support groups. The narrator doesn't yet know how big an impact Marla will have on him, nor how the chain reaction she sets in motion will upend every carefully furnished corner of his existence. For now, his world is locked in a standoff of sleepless nights, fleeting emotional release, and the faint beginnings of a conflict that will lead him far beyond insomnia into something much darker and strangely liberating. Chapter 2. Marla Singer's Interruption. In the days following Marla Singer's arrival in his sacred support group world, the narrator's mind whirled with question after question. He had been clinging to the reprieve the groups offered, an hour or two of raw communal empathy that allowed him to cry and finally sleep. Now, that sense of peace and purpose was being fractured by the mere presence of one stranger. He couldn't decide which infuriated him more, her brazen disregard for the group's sincerity, or the fact that she reminded him of his own deceitful presence in these meetings. It wasn't simply that her presence denied him the ability to cry, a vital release for his insomnia, though that was undoubtedly the trigger for his anger. It was that she existed as a mirror, reflecting the baseless charade he'd built around himself. She looked the part of a broken soul, worn-out clothes, cheap cigarette smoke clinging to her hair, but lacked any of the genuine suffering the rest of the group members carried. Yet when the narrator observed her out of the corner of his eye, he saw the same restless agitation that haunted him, the same exhausted slouch he assumed every morning in front of his bathroom mirror. Several nights of lost sleep finally drove him to confront her. He caught up with her after a support group for remaining men together, the group exclusively for men with testicular cancer. Naturally, Marla didn't belong there, and neither did he. As the circle ended, members exchanged encouraging hugs and reminders to stay strong. Marla stood on the periphery, fiddling with a cigarette she couldn't light indoors, her eyes distant and unreadable. The narrator tracked her as she slipped out the door. Stepping into the chilly night air, he inhaled the sting of secondhand smoke and cleared his throat. "You know you don't have cancer, right?" he remarked, aiming for a tone that was both accusatory and dryly sarcastic. Marla exhaled a thin, lazy stream of smoke into the alley. Her dark eyes flicked toward him with neither surprise nor amusement. "And you do," she retorted, arching her eyebrow. He felt the heat rise to his face. "This group means something to these people," he insisted, though the words rang hollow even in his own ears. "It's not a place for tourists." Marla scoffed softly and tapped her ash against a worn sneaker. "Look around. The only difference between us is that you found your little fix first." He blinked, unable to formulate a clever reply. She wasn't wrong. She studied him, eyes traveling from the dark circles beneath his lids down to the casual office attire that still clung to a semblance of neatness. Then, without waiting for his response, she turned and walked off into the darkness, leaving the narrator standing in the half-lit alleyway, feeling oddly exposed and strangely fascinated. Back in his condo that night, he tossed and turned, drifting in and out of anxious semi-consciousness. He was haunted by images of Marla, the tilt of her head when she smoked, the faint smirk that suggested she knew all his secrets, and the guarded loneliness in her gaze that struck closer to home than he cared to admit. When morning came, he resolved to find a way to rid himself of this intrusion so he could salvage the precious hours of sleep that these support groups offered him. At their next meeting, this time a group for people with blood parasites, they ended up alone together once again after the session concluded. The standard circle had disbanded, leaving the two of them in the poorly lit basement of an aging church. Folding chairs squeaked as they were stacked and put away by the last of the legitimate attendees. Marla lingered near the coat rack, her threadbare jacket slung over one arm, while the narrator approached with forced confidence. "We need to figure this out," he said. "We can't keep showing up at the same groups." Marla looked genuinely amused for half a second. "Oh, and you're going to tell me which support groups I can and can't visit?" He swallowed a flash of annoyance. "We can split them," he suggested. "You take certain nights, and I'll take the others. We never overlap, and nobody wonders why two healthy people are crying in a corner." Marla studied him, her eyes narrowed in calculation. For a moment, he thought she might simply blow him off and light another cigarette. Instead, she surprised him. She nodded and asked, "Which ones do you want?" The narrator, who had spent a borderline obsessive amount of time mapping out the groups, quickly listed them: testicular cancer, blood parasites, and brain tumors for him, sickle cell and melanoma for her, and so on. The arrangement was almost absurd in its details, yet they sealed it with the smallest nod of agreement. Though uneasy, the narrator felt a wave of relief as she strode out of the church basement, clicking her heels on the linoleum floor. Maybe now he could return to the predictable comfort of emotional purging, without her ghost-like presence derailing everything. For a while, this system seemed to work. He found it liberating to cry again at the testicular cancer group, or lose himself in the heartbreak of others' testimonies at the brain tumor meetings. Sleep returned, if only in patchy intervals, but it was enough to sustain him, and that was more than he'd had in a long time. But with every step he regained, Marla hovered on the edge of his consciousness. He would spot the faint swirl of cigarette smoke across the street as he exited a meeting, only to realize it was someone else. He would think he saw her in the corner of his eye at a coffee shop, only to blink and find the seat empty. The uneasy truth was that she had become part of his story, even if they rarely spoke. Their short negotiation had left him simultaneously drawn to her and resentful of her. In his mind, she was both threat and kindred spirit. One evening, after a particularly emotional session at a support group, the narrator stepped out into the cold and found Marla standing there, despite their strict schedule. She wasn't smoking. She was simply looking up at the sky with an air of vague detachment. His first reaction was anger. She was breaking the agreement, and by extension, threatening his fragile hold on rest. But as he opened his mouth to lash out, he noticed the dampness in her eyes. Marla quickly blinked it away, but the fleeting vulnerability he glimpsed stilled his accusation on his tongue. "What are you doing here?" he asked instead, softer than he intended. She shrugged. "Sometimes I just go where I'm not supposed to. Old habits, I guess." She gave a bitter laugh and then fixed her gaze on him. "This helps you sleep, right? These groups. That's why you're doing this." He hesitated, unsure if he owed her a truth he'd never spoken aloud. "It's the only thing that stops it." "Stops what?" "My head from spinning," he admitted, realizing how bare he felt under her scrutiny. They let the words settle. The narrator wondered how many nights Marla had spent as sleepless as him, wandering aimlessly, seeking an antidote to her own invisible burdens. Instead of an argument, a strange camaraderie flickered between them in that moment. as abruptly as she'd appeared, she slipped away into the night, leaving the narrator with a tangled knot of empathy and irritation in his gut. Over the following weeks, a fragile truce formed. They mostly stuck to their assigned groups, and the narrator took solace in the partial return of his emotional purge. When he did see Marla, on the rare occasion one of them drifted into a wrong session, there was no immediate confrontation, just a nod of acknowledgement. Sometimes, she'd toss him a half-smile that vanished before it could fully form, as if they shared a private joke. Other times, she'd silently leave before the session got too raw. Even with this system, he noticed his ability to fully immerse in the group's vulnerability was somewhat diminished. A subtle tension remained, reminding him that a second tourist lurked in this world. Their unspoken alliance, tense and mercurial, set the stage for everything that would follow in his life. In seeking to eliminate Marla Singer, the narrator had inadvertently invited her deeper into his thoughts. Now he found himself increasingly aware of her, of the wry way she observed people, of how she clung to the edge of any room like someone who needed a quick exit, of the sadness that turned below her mocking exterior. He found it maddening, and yet it also soothed a loneliness he hadn't acknowledged. By the end of this unofficial Chapter 2, the narrator's world had expanded in a most disquieting way. Despite his best efforts to banish Marla from his nightly refuge, she lingered there like a specter, reminding him that his sleepless nights and the deeper emptiness driving him to these groups were not entirely unique. In her unpredictable orbit, he saw a shadow of his own desperation, and though he wanted to believe that each found comfort on opposite schedules, the truth was that their paths were steadily converging, setting in motion the events that would unravel the narrator's life in ways he couldn't begin to imagine. Chapter 3. Meeting Tyler Durden. The narrator's life was spiraling in loops of uniform repetition, working a forgettable office job by day, attending support groups at night, sometimes sleeping better, sometimes not. His job required frequent business travel, a seemingly endless cycle of airports and overnight stays in chain hotels. He disliked these trips. The stale, recycled airplane air worsened his exhaustion, and the neutrality of hotel rooms made him feel more detached than ever. Yet, ironically, it was on a routine flight home that fate pushed him toward the next seismic shift in his life. He'd been stranded at a bustling airport terminal thanks to weather delays. Draped in a wrinkled shirt and tie, the narrator slumped in a cramped waiting area, half-lidded eyes scanning the TV monitors that announced delayed flights. At one point, he dozed off, only to jerk awake when they finally called for boarding. Stumbling onto the plane, carry-on in hand, he was too weary to pay much attention to those around him, until a seatmate with spiky hair and an irreverent grin started chatting him up. This stranger introduced himself casually, Tyler Durden, as if it were the most ordinary name in the world. Tyler wore mismatched clothing, loud prints, well-worn boots, and carried himself with a kind of rebellious ease that felt like a direct affront to the narrator's safe, dull existence. When the narrator mumbled something about being tired, Tyler quipped, "Did you know that oxygen on airplanes is actually mixed with a small dose of pure panic? It's like they want you to stay half awake." The narrator blinked. He couldn't tell if Tyler was serious or joking, yet Tyler's odd commentary cut through the monotony. Rather than the perfunctory small talk about jobs and destinations, their conversation leapt from philosophy to pop culture to soap making. Yes, soap making. Tyler explained, almost gleefully, how he created high-end soaps from discarded fat he appropriated from various sources. His casual mention of rendering human fat to make luxury bars startled the narrator, but also intrigued him. Most people he encountered were too polite or too shallow to engage in such blunt conversation. Tyler didn't filter his thoughts. He talked with conviction, even if his words veered into the bizarre. That unguarded boldness lit a spark of curiosity in the narrator, something that had been missing amid the corporate banality of his life. Their connection, however, was fleeting. The flight landed, they disembarked, and each went his separate way. The narrator offered a rushed thanks for the unexpectedly entertaining chat. Tyler replied with a wave and a nonchalant, "Maybe we'll meet again," as though it were a certainty. The narrator, exhausted and a little rattled by the encounter, simply nodded and drifted toward baggage claim. Days slipped by in a haze of routine. Then came the night the narrator's life imploded, quite literally. After a late work meeting, he trudged back to his high-rise condominium, arms filled with takeout containers and a sense of resignation at the idea of another solitary evening. The moment he stepped off the elevator onto his floor, a wave of heat and acrid smoke hit him. Pulsing red lights from the fire alarm flickered in the hallway. Several neighbors stood in pajamas, whispering anxiously. The narrator's heart lurched as he saw the door to his condo blasted open. Firefighters were milling around. Someone said something about a gas explosion, though no one could confirm the exact cause. He stood there, stunned, as paramedics cleared him from the wreckage site. Gone. Everything he'd meticulously collected, furniture, kitchenware, electronics, obliterated in a single catastrophic event. The meaningless yet carefully curated items that once defined his sense of self were now ash and twisted metal. In that moment, the narrator felt both a profound loss and an odd twinge of liberation. But mostly, he was in shock, unsure where to go or what to do next. Then he remembered Tyler Durden's business card. Amid the flaming wreckage, the narrator rummaged through his pockets. Remarkably, he found it tucked behind a crumpled receipt, Tyler's name scrawled in bold, messy letters. With nowhere else to turn and no immediate shelter available, the narrator dialed Tyler's number from a payphone downstairs. His heart was pounding with adrenaline, grief, and confusion as Tyler answered. The narrator blurted out the story. "My place. It's gone. Everything. You're the only person I know in this city who might pick up the phone." Tyler paused, then said calmly, "Sure, we can meet for a drink." Seated in a dimly lit bar, the smell of stale beer and cigarettes in the air, the narrator recounted the explosion. Tyler sipped his drink quietly and listened with rapt attention, occasionally tossing out quips like, "You see how everything you own ends up owning you," or "Losing all that stuff might be the best thing that's ever happened to you." These casual, almost flippant remarks stung, yet they also contained a peculiar brand of honesty. The narrator, unsure whether to feel insulted or comforted, simply sighed. He was too tired and numb to debate the philosophies of consumerism and material loss. The night wore on, and soon it became clear the narrator had no place to sleep. Tyler offered a solution. "Stay at my place for a while." The narrator found himself hesitating, but the alternative, sleeping on a park bench or dropping hundreds on a hotel room, pushed him to accept. They finished their drinks and stepped outside into the crisp air. That was when Tyler made his strange request. "I want you to do me a favor. Hit me as hard as you can." It was such an abrupt question that the narrator thought he'd misheard. "Excuse me. I want to feel something. I want to see what'll happen if you lose control for once," Tyler said, a half-smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Give it your best shot." At first, the narrator laughed, assuming it was a joke, but Tyler stood there, arms loose at his sides, eyes unwavering. A mixture of trepidation and lingering frustration from the night's chaos churned in the narrator's gut. Without fully understanding why, He drew back his fist and struck Tyler's shoulder. The impact jolted pain up the narrator's arm. Tyler staggered, then came back with a punch to the narrator's ribs. It hurt. God, it hurt. But beneath the pain was a sudden rush of clarity, like someone had flipped a switch, lighting up nerves that had been dulled for years. They ended up brawling awkwardly in the bar's parking lot, exchanging bruises, dirt scraping against their knees. It wasn't graceful or choreographed. It was raw, messy, and undeniably liberating. When they finally staggered apart, both men were breathing heavily, adrenaline coursing through them. Tyler was grinning, a faint trickle of blood at the corner of his lip. The narrator wiped at a bruise forming on his jaw and found himself smiling too, an odd sense of camaraderie blossoming in the pain. That was the night the narrator truly met Tyler Durden. It was no longer just an airplane conversation. Now there was violence, raw and immediate, a truth unspoken but vividly felt in the crunch of knuckles and the sting of a split lip. The narrator sensed that Tyler saw the same emptiness in him that he'd recognized in the echo of his own sleepless nights. But Tyler was forging a path out of that emptiness, one that involved fists, bruises, and a mindset that challenged every polite social boundary the narrator had known. Soon, the two of them climbed into a battered, paint-chipped car that Tyler drove out to his home on Paper Street. Nestled in a run-down industrial neighborhood, the house stood in stark contrast to the narrator's former upscale condo. Rotting boards, a sagging porch, leaky roofs, everything about the place exuded neglect. The narrator's first impulse was to recoil, but as Tyler led him inside, flicking on a dim light bulb swaying from the ceiling, the narrator felt something else, a strange sense of possibility. The place was eerily quiet, the rooms nearly empty, except for random pieces of mismatched furniture and piles of random debris. Even so, it felt alive in a way his old condo never had. Tyler showed him to a makeshift bedroom on the second floor. The plumbing groaned in the walls, the floor creaked underfoot. Still, it was a place to lie down and close his eyes. Collapsing onto an old mattress, the narrator let out a breath he'd been holding for what felt like weeks. He wondered if he'd wake up the next morning, only to discover this was all a surreal dream. But the bruises on his body assured him it was real. By the end of this chaotic night, the narrator realized that he was tethered to Tyler Durden by a sense of reckless camaraderie he'd never before experienced. The explosion that claimed his condo marked the end of one life and the beginning of another, and Tyler Durden stood at the crossroads. In the days that followed, the narrator would come to see Tyler not just as a quirky soap maker, but as a personification of all the anger, disenchantment, and untamed ambition simmering beneath the surface of his formerly passive existence. For now, though, he was just grateful not to be alone, bruised, homeless, and strangely exhilarated by the turn his life had taken. Chapter 4, The Creation of Fight Club. For days after the narrator settled into Tyler Durden's ramshackle Paper Street house, the two men maintained a strange, symbiotic routine. They woke in the early mornings to the sound of groaning pipes and buzzing insects, no longer the sleek hum of a downtown apartment. Tyler would be busy boiling fat into soap in the grimy kitchen, or concocting new, ever more eccentric side projects. The narrator, still raw from losing his home and shaken by his first taste of real violence, felt a surge of restless energy whenever he was around Tyler. Nighttime was when that energy found its focus. It started as a continuation of the brawl they'd had in the bar's parking lot. Most evenings, the two men shared a few beers, exchanging stories or half-philosophical rants about modern life, consumerism, and the emptiness of polite society. At some pivotal moment, maybe after the third beer, or maybe when the tension and cabin fever became palpable, One of them would look at the other with that unspoken question. Ready for a fight? They'd step outside into the muggy night air, battered knuckles and bruised bodies still throbbing from the previous scuffle. Yet, that pain was a siren call, pulling them toward a new understanding of themselves. A punch to the ribs could ignite a jolt of clarity, reminding them they were still alive in a world that often felt anesthetized. Each blow became a rush of adrenaline, and in the aftermath, an odd sense of mutual respect settled between them. Far from animosity, their fights were a form of twisted communion. Eventually, the narrator and Tyler took these parking lot brawls back to the bar where their first fight had taken place. They were recognized by the bartender on duty, who offered them a private corner of the basement after hours, provided they kept it low-key. By then, word had spread among a handful of curious onlookers who'd caught glimpses of the narrator and Tyler's scuffles. Some found it perverse, but others felt a magnetic pull. Men approached them, men weary of repetitious office jobs, precarious relationships, and the sense that something was missing from their lives. They wanted to feel that jolt, that raw authenticity. One Friday night, the narrator and Tyler found themselves in the grimy basement, surrounded by maybe a dozen men. The air was musty, the yellowish light from a lone bulb casting harsh shadows on concrete walls. The men were awkward at first, reluctant to strip away the politeness of daily life. Many came in collared shirts or crisp business casual, as if they weren't sure how else to show up. But Tyler, pacing with a casual arrogance, addressed them all. He invited them to watch as he and the narrator began to throw punches. Blood smeared across knuckles, heavy breaths echoed off the cinder block walls, and by the end of it, at least 2 other men had stepped forward, wanting to trade blows, feeling the primal urge to release pent-up frustration. From that night on, it became a regular event. Each week, same day, same dingy basement. Men who had never thrown a punch in their adult lives found themselves drawn to the ring of onlookers. At first, it was chaotic, a jumble of half-drunk amateurs slugging it out. But as the group expanded, Tyler realized they needed structure, a system to maintain order. That's when he dictated the rules of what they'd come to call Fight Club. The rules were simple, yet absolute. You do not talk about Fight Club. You do not talk about Fight Club. If someone said stop or went limp, the fight was over. Only 2 guys to a fight. 1 fight at a time. No shirts, no shoes. Fights go on as long as they have to. If it was your first night at Fight Club, you had to fight. The narrator listened in awe as Tyler laid out these regulations like a modern-day prophet. The men in that basement, bankers, waiters, middle managers, absorbed each word with a reverent intensity. They finally had a place to vent their rage and dissatisfaction, and ironically, these strict rules gave them the freedom to do so without letting the chaos spiral. Something about the tension and sincerity of these battles made them feel more real than anything else in the narrator's life. The stark fluorescent bulb, the stink of sweat and blood, the adrenaline pounding in his head. This was a far cry from soft living and insomnia-induced apathy. He caught glimpses of men who had timidly introduced themselves mere weeks ago, now standing tall with bruised faces, almost proud of their scars. It was liberating. After each fight, the narrator noticed a sort of calm washing over him, the same relief he'd chased through support groups, but infinitely more potent. As the narrator and Tyler walked home some nights, battered and panting, Tyler would expound on the deeper meaning of their makeshift club. In Tyler's view, modern existence had dulled men's instincts, turned them into cogs obsessed with status, comfort, and possessions. Self-improvement is masturbation, he once scoffed, but self-destruction, that's real. The narrator found something simultaneously unsettling and compelling in these words. Tyler radiated a magnetic confidence, and the narrator clung to it like a lifeline, even as it led them into increasingly extreme territory. Soon, the bar's basement was filled to capacity each week, men jockeying to take part. Fights would erupt in the small hours of the morning, pairs taking turns pummeling each other, while others observed in hushed awe. Oddly enough, the narrator noticed that these men didn't necessarily hate one another. In fact, it was the opposite. After a fight, two combatants might help each other up, shoulders heaving with exhaustion, exchanging a brief smile or nod, forging an odd bond through shared blows. There were no illusions, no lies, just the raw truth of pain and confrontation. Outside the club, he began to see the ripple effects. Men who joined Fight Club would suddenly stop complaining about inconsequential workplace grievances. They seemed more confident in daily life, less shaken by the petty slings and arrows of routine. Bruises on their faces and knuckles were worn almost like badges of honor, though they all tried to remain discreet, abiding by the rule of secrecy Tyler had so vehemently demanded. The narrator, too, carried himself differently at work, projecting an aura of unpredictability that unnerved his coworkers. People gave him a wider berth. Meanwhile, Marla Singer drifted through the narrator's periphery. She popped up at odd hours, sometimes calling the house on Paper Street when she was in a panic about something trivial, sometimes dropping by unexpectedly. Tyler tolerated her presence with a peculiar mix of disdain and fascination. The narrator couldn't piece together exactly what was going on between them, but their late-night arguments or intimate noises from Tyler's cramped bedroom made him uneasy. At times, it felt like Marla was trying to infiltrate a domain that was strictly male, strictly about Fight Club, though she never directly asked about the bruises or the hush-hush gatherings. Tyler, on the other hand, doubled down on the narrator's membership in this clandestine world. When the narrator came home with a badly split lip, Tyler laughed and handed him a cold bottle of beer, then broke down the mechanics of how to avoid the same mistake next time. Their dynamic became an intense mentorship, less about moral guidance and more about unchaining suppressed impulses. Under Tyler's watchful eye, the narrator discovered surprising reserves of aggression he never knew he possessed. And though part of him recoiled at the violence, another part welcomed the rawness of it. Before long, Fight Club became more than just a weekly event. It turned into a secret subculture. New faces appeared in the basement each time. Some nights, the bar owner complained about broken furniture or bloodstains, but Tyler smoothly negotiated with him, emphasizing the unspoken perks of a dedicated clientele who always bought drinks after the fights. Eventually, the bartender pulled the narrator aside and confided that word was traveling beyond their circle. Other bars and other basements might soon take up the mantle. The narrator felt a flicker of excitement and apprehension. He realized that Fight Club was no longer just a weird pastime for a handful of alienated men. It was evolving into something bigger, something that could, in Tyler's hands, become a movement. Late one evening, after the final bruised fighters shook hands and cleared out of the bar's basement, Tyler stood in the center of the room, surveying the blood-smeared floor and the battered chairs. The narrator watched him, studying the half-smile on Tyler's face. It wasn't a grin of malice. It was more like triumph, or maybe even pride. Tyler was seeing the fruits of his unorthodox vision. Men waking up to the notion that they could break free from the constraints society had placed on them, if only they were willing to endure the pain of real confrontation. Standing there, the narrator felt an inward tremor. In some ways, he owed Tyler everything. A place to stay, a sense of belonging, and a newfound capacity to actually feel something in a numb world. Yet a small voice in the back of his mind whispered caution, reminding him of how quickly this underground phenomenon was ballooning beyond anyone's control. Still, he brushed aside the doubt. For the moment, it felt too good to stop. Where else could he find such visceral release, such authentic camaraderie? And so Fight Club, born of chance and nurtured by violence, was no longer just Tyler Durden's weekend hobby. It was an institution forged from primal impulses, attracting men longing for an antidote to the numbing effects of routine. They came to bleed and bruise, to discover who they were beneath office suits and social niceties. First rule, you do not talk about Fight Club. But ironically, even as the words rolled off Tyler's tongue, the whispers were already spreading, the seeds of something far larger than any basement could contain. Chapter 5, Double Lives. Mornings came reluctantly in the Paper Street house. Stale air, the lingering smell of dried sweat, and the persistent trickle of leaky pipes were the first stimuli that greeted the narrator when he opened his eyes. He'd peel himself off a torn mattress, stretch bruised muscles, and slip on crumpled work clothes that still clung to the faint odor of the bar's basement. Once in a while, he'd catch a reflection of himself in a cracked mirror, noting how fresh bruises mixed with old ones in a mosaic of purples, blues, and greens. At first glance, he hardly recognized the person staring back at him. He'd force down a cup of instant coffee while tiptoeing around Tyler Durden's late-night experiments, chemical containers and soap molds scattered on the counters. Marla Singer's presence added to the morning after chaos. Sometimes she emerged from the shadowy upstairs bedroom, hair disheveled, a cigarette already perched between her lips. She might wordlessly watch the narrator, or maybe trade a half nod with him if she wasn't in the mood to talk. Other days, she'd step outside for a smoke, still wearing the same rumpled dress from the night before. Their interactions had settled into an odd tension. Not exactly strangers, not exactly friends, thrown together under a collapsing roof in a dysfunctional household. Still, the narrator trudged to work each day, punching the clock and sitting at the same desk he'd once occupied in relative anonymity. Now his black eyes and split lips drew sidelong glances from coworkers. Curiosity ran high, but few dared to pry openly. Some assumed he'd taken up a high-contact sport, or perhaps had an abusive relationship outside the office. Others suspected he'd gotten involved in something shady, though few could pin down exactly what. In truth, the narrator found it strangely liberating. He no longer blended seamlessly into the corporate landscape. His battered face served as a silent challenge to a world of polite illusions. As the narrator's bruises became weekly fixtures, his manager finally summoned him into an office. A stiff man who measured his concern in carefully modulated corporate speak, the manager couched his worries in terms of business efficiency and work environment. He asked if the narrator felt safe at home, if there was anything the company could do to support him. The narrator offered vague assurances, dropped phrases like underground boxing gym and just letting off steam. The manager frowned, but seemed too wary of overstepping personal boundaries. The matter was left unresolved, and the narrator walked out feeling a renewed sense of freedom. If no one at work cared to probe deeper, he had no obligation to explain Fight Club's raw reality. Nights, however, were a different story altogether. The fights grew more frequent and more intense. Men from every social class and background now crammed into dingy basements across town. So many that the narrator began hearing whispers of new fight clubs springing up in other locations. He'd show up after a grueling day at the office, tension knotted in his shoulders, only to find release in a blur of fists and adrenaline. By the time he limped back to Paper Street in the early hours of morning, he was often too exhausted to do more than collapse onto his makeshift bed, letting pain and fatigue lull him into unconsciousness. Tyler Durden, meanwhile, thrived on the chaos. He seemed to feed off the energy of these nightly gatherings, his grin growing wider with each new recruit who discovered the rush of bare-knuckle violence. When the narrator would stumble home battered and half-delirious, Tyler would greet him with some cryptic observation, something about how they were shaking off society's shackles, or how pain was the one true constant in a world of lies. Occasionally, Tyler's monologues veered into outright cynicism about corporate life, consumerism, and the hollowness of the American dream. And for the most part, the narrator found himself agreeing. After all, he'd tried living the conventional path and ended up an insomniac, weighed down by possessions that went up in literal smoke. Maybe Tyler's worldview had merit. The real complication was Marla. She had a habit of drifting unpredictably through their domain. Sometimes she'd vanish for a week, only to reappear in the dead of night, letting herself in with a key Tyler had presumably given her. When the narrator bumped into her in the hallway, they'd exchange tense greetings. She might toss out an offhand insult, "You look like hell," or, "Did you get that black eye from your soap-making friend?" The narrator would shrug and mumble some reply, not quite sure whether to defend Tyler or blame him. The truth was, it wasn't clear who was the bigger influence on him, Tyler or Marla, but both seemed equally entangled in his changing identity. One evening, after a particularly brutal bout at Fight Club, the narrator returned to find Marla perched on the rickety living room sofa. A single lamp illuminated the space, revealing dust motes swirling in the stagnant air. She nursed a cup of instant coffee, her posture slouched and eyes half closed in thought. Without looking up, she asked in her lazy drawl, "Are you two trying to kill yourselves, or just each other?" He tossed his bag aside and rubbed the fresh welts on his knuckles. "It's not about killing, it's about feeling alive," he replied, echoing one of Tyler's many refrains. Marla finally glanced at him, skepticism etched into her features. "Since when does feeling alive involve losing your teeth?" He let out a short, humorless laugh. "You wouldn't get it unless you tried it." She held his gaze for a beat, the silence thickening between them. Then, as if to dismiss the whole subject, she stood up and wandered toward the kitchen, leaving the narrator alone with the low hum of a broken fan. It was one of the few direct exchanges they'd had in weeks. The narrator felt uncomfortably exposed, as if Marla had caught a glimpse of something he wasn't ready to show. Tyler brushed off her concerns as byproducts of the system, insisting she'd never grasp the deeper meaning of their battles. But the narrator couldn't forget the intensity of Marla's stare. It lingered long after she disappeared upstairs. He wondered if she pitied him, or if she was envious. At the office, the narrator's transformation grew increasingly evident. No longer content to bow to petty corporate demands, he found himself challenging authority in small but surprising ways, questioning processes, ignoring dress code guidelines, and even dozing off in meetings without apology. Co-workers who once saw him as an anonymous cog now viewed him with a mix of curiosity and alarm. Behind it all, the narrator nurtured a secret pride. They have no idea that tomorrow night, or the night after, I'll be down there in that basement, hearing the crunch of bone against bone, reaffirming some primal sense of self. That knowledge buoyed him through each tedious workday. In the evenings, however, his battered body provided a constant reminder that he was walking a precarious line. His muscles ached with bruises. His face bore the mosaic of past fights. Even shaking hands in a business context sent sharp pains shooting through half-healed knuckles. Sleep came in irregular bursts. Sometimes he slept like the dead after a night of fights. Other times, he lay awake, mind spinning with a cocktail of adrenaline and Tyler's impassioned rhetoric. During these restless nights, he'd think of Marla sleeping in another part of the house, and Tyler pacing the rooms or conjuring new plans in the basement. He felt caught between their gravitational pulls, uncertain which orbit truly encompassed him. Increasingly, Tyler and the narrator spent less time simply sparring in the basement and more time discussing the potential purpose of Fight Club. Tyler spoke of bigger ambitions, training men not just to fight, but to question the very structures that pinned them down. The narrator listened, enthralled by the scope of Tyler's imagination, yet secretly uneasy. He joined Fight Club for release, a cure for insomnia and existential dread. Now Tyler was hinting at stirring the pot on a grander scale, shaping Fight Club into something that could challenge cultural norms, or even topple them entirely. Despite the philosophical debates and the building sense that Fight Club was expanding, each day still forced the narrator to return to his desk, battered face in plain view. Between phone calls and spreadsheets, he'd find himself daydreaming of that subterranean sanctuary where rules melted away into pure, violent catharsis. He started to dread the sunshine world above ground, where people spoke in polite codes and avoided direct conflict, all the while simmering with unspoken resentment. The more time he spent in the basement at night, the more the daytime world felt like a facade, a brittle, breakable shell over something vastly more real and primal. Yet as the raw excitement of double living gave way to routine, cracks appeared. Bruises took longer to heal, and the fights began to escalate beyond a friendly test of will. Some men arrived at Fight Club with a desperation bordering on mania, fueled by personal tragedies or seething rage at the monotony of their jobs. Others seemed to lose themselves entirely in the violence, emerging from each match with bloodshot eyes that hinted at a darkness deeper than mere rebellion. The narrator noticed these shifts, but said nothing. Tyler's unwavering confidence made dissent feel almost blasphemous. And then there was Marla. Sometimes she'd stumble into the house at dawn, eyes rimmed with mascara streaks, perhaps from another pointless encounter at a support group or a night wandering the city. She rarely acknowledged the narrator's injuries, and he rarely asked about her errands. When he did, she'd snap back with a sardonic comment or laugh at how pathetic the world was, a laugh that contained more sadness than mirth. It was in this strange, tenuous equilibrium that the narrator continued, working an unremarkable job by day, immersing himself in punishing fights by night, and sleeping, when he could, in the decaying Paper Street house. Tyler's restless presence and Marla's sardonic detachment formed the twin pillars of his life outside the office. He had a secret that no one else at work could fathom, and that secret gave him a sense of purpose, even if it was laced with pain and mystery. This double life, as he came to think of it, was not sustainable. Though the narrator tried to maintain control, the momentum of Fight Club rolled onward, drawing in more followers, stoking more questions, and pushing boundaries he hadn't anticipated. For now, the juggling act continued. Wage slave at sunrise, underground fighter at midnight. Each role seemed incomplete without the other, like two conflicting halves of the same fractured identity. In the half-lit corridors of the Paper Street house, with Tyler crafting new visions for a grander enterprise, and Marla quietly observing from the corners, the narrator felt the first tremors of a coming upheaval, one that would test the limits of how many selves a single person could inhabit before something finally gave way. Chapter 6. Expansion and Project Mayhem. The nights in the Paper Street house were never quiet. Pipes groaned, floorboards creaked under prowling footsteps, and sometimes the dull thuds of an improvised workout session echoed from the dilapidated garage out back. The narrator had grown accustomed to these sounds, had sense, but didn't fully grasp. It started with whispers. The narrator would stand in front of a coffee machine at work and overhear two colleagues, neither of whom he recognized from the basement in his part of town, mentioning a covert fight in a storage facility across the river. He caught bits of jargon that echoed Tyler's rules. When he paid his bus fare one evening, he noticed the driver had a black eye and a faint smile, as if harboring the same clandestine secret. Indeed, Fight Club was no longer confined to a single moldy basement. Chapters sprang up in different neighborhoods, each with its own after-hours gathering spot. Before long, Tyler began hearing about these far-flung fight clubs himself. The news didn't anger him. On the contrary, he was fascinated. He watched it all unfold like a social experiment he'd unintentionally launched. But a quiet determination flickered in his eyes, as if he were contemplating how to harness the surge of momentum. "Men are waking up," he said to the narrator one night, pacing the living room with an unlit cigarette between his fingers. "They're realizing there's more to life than a paycheck and a chain around their necks." The narrator nodded, though he couldn't shake a faint sense of unease. The basement fights used to be the end goal, catharsis, a raw release of frustration. Now it felt as though Tyler had begun to see them as a stepping stone, a mechanism for recruiting men who do more than just throw punches on a Saturday night. The narrator watched as Tyler scribbled notes on scraps of paper, disjointed ideas about coordinated pranks, sabotage, and collective action. If Fight Club was a stage, Tyler was preparing to mount a new production. Then came the night Tyler told the narrator to gather a small group of the most dedicated fighters and bring them to the Paper Street house after hours. They arrived in ones and twos, eyes alive with anticipation. In the flickering glow of a single hanging lamp, Tyler surveyed them like a ringmaster. A hush fell over the dingy living room, and Tyler announced, almost offhandedly, "We're going to do more than fight. We're going to remind the world how fragile it really is." He called it Project Mayhem. In Tyler's vision, it was a collective dedicated to acts of subversion, strategic vandalism, guerrilla pranks, anything that would puncture the bloated complacency of society. "Most people are asleep," Tyler intoned, pacing in front of the group. "Drugged by comfort and consumption, we're going to jolt them awake, make them see they're not in control." The men listened with rapt attention. Some nodded in agreement. Others looked nervous but intrigued. The narrator stood off to the side, his arms folded, torn between fascination and a growing sense that they were crossing a line. Still, he said nothing. Tyler's charisma was a force of nature. Raising objections felt like spitting into a hurricane. Within days, the Paper Street house was transformed into a makeshift headquarters. The once empty rooms filled with cots and sleeping bags as more recruits appeared, drawn by rumors of Tyler's next-level plan. These men shaved their heads, donned black clothes, and gave up their old identities with unsettling readiness. They hung on Tyler's every word. A new set of rules was established. Strict silence about the group's existence, unwavering obedience to Tyler's directives, and complete willingness to do whatever was asked. Tyler assigned tasks with calm authority. Someone was in charge of making soap, another in charge of printing fake ID cards, another of scouting city locations for deviant art installations. Each project had a coded name, each mission a thin layer of plausible deniability. The narrator watched this all unfold with conflicting emotions. On one hand, he saw men who had been lost, disillusioned, angry, stuck in dead-end jobs, find a sense of purpose in Tyler's vision. They formed a community, however extreme, that gave them clear rules and a cause bigger than themselves. Yet on the other hand, The narrator felt a creeping sense of dread as he passed silent drones in the hallway, each ready to leap at Tyler's command. The line between empowerment and fanaticism blurred, especially as the stunts escalated beyond harmless pranks into more serious property destruction. Late one night, the narrator was jolted awake by the sound of hammering and muffled shouting from the backyard. He peered out of his bedroom window and saw a group of shirtless men, each with a shaved head, digging something in the moonlight. Tyler stood among them, motioning directions. The scene reminded the narrator of a paramilitary camp rather than the old, haphazard fights. Tension twisted in his gut. What exactly were they building or burying under the decaying Paper Street lawn? And then there were the missions. Under Tyler's leadership, Project Mayhem teams roamed the city, leaving a trail of minor chaos. Windows soaped, billboards vandalized with cryptic slogans, fancy cars splotched with paint. The local news began to run scattered reports of an underground vandal network. The narrator recognized the trademark style of Tyler's stunts. He felt a strange mix of pride and apprehension. When he confronted Tyler about the growing scale and risk, Tyler simply grinned. "You can't make an omelet without breaking eggs, my friend," he said, patting the narrator on the shoulder like he was a nervous child. Marla Singer hovered on the periphery, neither fully involved nor entirely detached. She still dropped by unannounced, rummaging through the kitchen for coffee or cigarettes. Once, she cornered the narrator in the hallway, eyeing the men in black clothes who strode through the house with single-minded determination. "What the hell is all this?" she demanded, her voice low. "They look like brainwashed monks." The narrator could only shrug. Explaining Project Mayhem would have meant exposing Tyler's grand design, something that felt equal parts thrilling and dangerous. Marla snorted and shook her head. "This is going to blow up in your faces," she muttered before storming off. As Project Mayhem accelerated, the narrator's own role became murky. During fights, men who once treated him as an equal fighter now addressed him like a lieutenant. "We follow your lead," they'd say, because Tyler said so. It dawned on the narrator that Tyler had been subtly positioning him as a figure of authority, perhaps to maintain a chain of command, or perhaps as a safeguard for when Tyler wasn't around. Strangely, Tyler himself began to vanish for days at a time, leaving cryptic notes about field research. Whenever he returned, he brought new ideas, new targets, and an ever-mounting fervor for toppling the status quo. One evening, the narrator finally pressed Tyler. "Where do you go when you disappear?" Tyler flashed a grin. "Wherever I'm needed," he said, offering no real explanation. "Look, if I died right now, you'd carry on the mission, right?" The narrator stammered. "That's not the point. But Tyler cut him off with a gentle laugh. "You'll see. The seeds are planted. All we have to do is help them grow." In the basement, where Fight Club had once ruled supreme, the mood was different now. Sure, fights still broke out, punctuating each evening with bruises and blood, but the men came mostly to share updates on missions, to swap intel on materials or possible sabotage sites. The narrator felt the raw passion of those old fights start to mutate into something more controlled, more directed. He realized that his insomnia, once cured by the catharsis of punching and being punched, was threatening to return in the face of a rapidly spiraling reality he wasn't sure he wanted. Somewhere between exhilaration and alarm, the narrator watched as Project Mayhem rose in tandem with Fight Club's expansion. The city became a canvas for Tyler's rebellious vision, each strike fueling the next. The men shaved their heads, relinquished their previous lives, and recited Tyler's mantras about freedom from societal constraints. And Tyler, charismatic, unsettling Tyler, was the epicenter of it all, orchestrating chaos chaos while remaining oddly serene. In quieter moments, the narrator caught glimpses of himself in stained mirrors around the house. The reflection he saw was gaunter, more haggard, yet shot through with an energy he couldn't name. Is this who I wanted to be? He sometimes wondered. Or am I just orbiting Tyler's gravitational pull, unable to break free? But there was no time for existential doubt. Project Mayhem marched forward, unstoppable. The men in black continued to multiply. Their missions grew bolder, attacking corporate art installations, repainting entire street blocks with subversive messages, sabotaging power lines to create fleeting blackouts, and each success emboldened them further. The Paper Street house itself had become a symbol of this new order. Crowded cots, strict regimens, the aroma of homemade soap mingling with the stench of unwashed bodies. The men avoided idle chatter. They were single-minded, driven by Tyler's dream of tearing down societal illusions. Any sense of hobby or therapy that once defined Fight Club was gone. This was a movement, and it was only a matter of time before something, or someone, pushed it to the brink. For now, the narrator stayed on that razor's edge, half enthralled by Tyler's vision, half unnerved by the lengths to which his disciples were willing to go. Each morning, as he prepared for another day of cubicle drudgery, he wondered how many more nights he'd witnessed the city bending under Tyler's master plan, and always, just beneath his mounting concerns, burned a fierce curiosity. What if Tyler is right? What if this is how we finally break free? Chapter 7. Growing Paranoia. At the Paper Street house, the days slid into nights with little distinction, creating an unrelenting cycle of tasks, sleep deprivation, and whispered orders. The narrator could hardly recall the last time he'd sat down for a quiet meal or taken a moment to breathe without the cadence of Tyler Durden's plans drumming in his mind. It was no longer enough to maintain the local fight clubs. Tyler had expanded Project Mayhem to a scale the narrator never thought possible. Men poured in from out of state, arriving at the sagging front porch in the dead of night. They carried meager bags and fervent expressions, as though drawn by an invisible beacon. Every new arrival followed the same initiation script. Stand on the porch for 3 days, endure verbal abuse and dismissals, and then, if they persisted, they were welcomed inside. The narrator marveled at how willingly these recruits subjected themselves to Tyler's psychological hazing, going without food or sleep, waiting for acceptance that could vanish at the first sign of complaint. It reminded him of a boot camp, only with no official uniforms or government oversight. Yet each man shaved his head, changed out of his old clothes, and emerged ready to serve Project Mayhem's clandestine aims without question. Inside the house, living conditions deteriorated by the day. Cracked windows let in cool drafts. The water in the shower ran a murky brown. Cots filled every spare room, lined up like rows in a barracks. Chatter remained minimal. Tyler had drilled into everyone the importance of staying focused on the mission. At meals, recruits gulped down bland, soupy concoctions, and then rushed off to an unending list of chores, labeling soap products, forging documents, assembling homemade explosives. The narrator felt a sick twinge of awe seeing the level of devotion that Tyler commanded. When had Tyler become a figure of near religious authority? Amid this chaos, Tyler himself began to slip away for days at a time. He offered no real explanation, maybe a cryptic remark about scouting new locations or helping other chapters get on their feet. Whenever he vanished, the narrator found himself the de facto leader, giving orders or clarifying Tyler's rules. The men called him Sir, or addressed him with a frightening level of deference. Yet, beneath the official veneer, the narrator felt panic gnawing at his core. He had never asked to be their commander. He'd swear he locked it, but there it was, slightly open, revealing the dim hallway. He rose, heart pounding, and peered into the corridor. No one was there. Yet a nagging anxiety buzzed in his mind. Who had opened it, and why? He shook off the paranoia and told himself it was just a draft or someone looking for an empty cot. But the suspicion lingered. The next morning, he found his briefcase, the one he used for his office job, moved from where he'd left it. Slightly shifted, as if someone had rummaged inside. Nothing was missing, though. He asked a few recruits if they'd touched it, but they denied even being in his room. It was a small thing, yet it sharpened his unease. Am I losing my mind, or is someone snooping? He wondered. As the number of recruits ballooned, the narrator realized he no longer recognized half the people sleeping in the house. It felt like a tinderbox of unwavering loyalty to Tyler alone, and he wasn't sure where he stood if Tyler wasn't around. Increasingly, he noticed that the fervor of Project Mayhem's loyalists went beyond the violence of Fight Club. Many recruits genuinely believed that Tyler was some sort of visionary who would reshape society. They ate up his speeches about corporate oppression and materialistic emptiness. The narrator could see it in their eyes, devotion that veered toward fanaticism. He recalled how Tyler once quipped, "The things you own end up owning you," and realized that these men had abandoned everything, from apartments to jobs to families, just to serve Tyler's cause. Wasn't that just another form of ownership? Each night, teams of Project Mayhem, space monkeys, as Tyler liked to call them, left the Paper Street house to carry out acts of vandalism and subversion across the city. Banks had their windows shattered. Corporate offices awoke to graffiti messages proclaiming, "Wake up," or "You are not your job." On one particular evening, the narrator was roped into a mission involving the defacement of a luxury car dealership. He recalled smearing paint thinner across expensive cars while recruits set off homemade smoke bombs. The adrenaline rush felt oddly familiar, like the old fight nights, but tinged with a disquieting undercurrent. We're crossing a line, he thought, but didn't speak up. He wasn't sure anyone would listen. It got worse when the narrator saw reports on the local news. Masked vandals had destroyed property belonging to high-profile executives. A few arrests were made, but those arrested refused to give names or talk to police. They sat in their holding cells in silent protest, as if operating by a higher law. The narrator recognized some faces, men who had bunked in the Paper Street house. He felt a simultaneous pang of guilt and an odd admiration for their stoicism. They're loyal to Tyler, he told himself, not to me. That realization didn't stop him from wondering if the police might eventually trace the threads back to Paper Street. As worry gnawed at him, Marla Singer reappeared. She drifted through the house, rolling her eyes at the buzz-cut men who marched around with practiced discipline. "You're running a cult," she told the narrator flatly one morning, sipping weak coffee by the grimy sink. "Does that scare you?" He tried to deny it. "It's not a cult. It's... She cut him off with a bitter laugh. "Whatever helps you sleep at night." Then she stomped away, leaving a thin cloud of cigarette smoke behind her. Marla's words echoed in his mind. Cult. Had Tyler Durden unwittingly, or perhaps deliberately, become the leader of an army? One afternoon, the narrator decided to track Tyler down, determined to confront him about the operation spiraling out of control. It took a series of phone calls, coded conversations with recruits in other cities, and random guesses at addresses Tyler might be using. He discovered that Tyler had hopped a bus to Chicago, allegedly to meet a local Fight Club cell. Gripped by a sense of urgency, the narrator left his job midday, bruises still visible on his face, to catch a flight and confront identical black clothes, their eyes vacant with unwavering zeal. "He's not here," said one of them. "He left." Frustrated, the narrator demanded more information. They remained silent, as if Tyler's whereabouts were a sacred secret. Realizing he'd hit a dead end, the narrator stormed out. "Is Tyler avoiding me on purpose?" he wondered. It felt as though Tyler was always a few steps ahead, orchestrating an invisible master plan. Alone in a strange city, the narrator realized how fully Project Mayhem had spread. Even there, far from Paper Street, men nodded at him with recognition in public spaces. It was as if they saw him as Tyler's right hand. The sense of being watched doubled his anxiety. Determined to return home and figure out the next move, he caught a late flight back to his own city, mind racing with half-formed theories. What if Tyler never wanted me to find him? What if that's part of the plan? To remain elusive, so no one can stop this from ballooning. Back at the Paper Street house, he found it bustling even at midnight. Bright lights illuminated the front yard, where a new group of recruits practiced some form of drill under the watchful eye of a senior Project Mayhem member. The narrator slipped past them into the shadowy interior. The air felt charged, suffused with purpose and tension. It struck him that Tyler's absence had done little to slow the operation. In fact, it might have accelerated it. Missions were being carried out daily, new recruits were arriving in droves, and the city was becoming a giant chessboard for Tyler's increasingly bold maneuvers. In bed that night, the narrator lay awake, the floor shaking occasionally from someone's footsteps in the hall. Sleep eluded him. His mind reeled with the scale of what Tyler had created. This sprawling network of men ready to execute any order, no questions asked. Fight Club used to be about release, about shedding anxiety and waking up, he thought. Now, it feels like we're building something unstoppable, something that might eat us alive. Yet even as apprehension gnawed at him, he could not deny a stubborn, twisted pride in being part of such a massive upheaval. Tyler Durden had tapped into a well of discontent that stretched far deeper than either of them had realized. Whether that energy would free them or destroy them was unclear. The narrator's paranoia now intertwined with fascination, leaving him neither fully able to break away nor entirely comfortable staying put. One thing was certain. Tyler Durden had become the invisible puppet master of Project Mayhem. And for the narrator, each passing day brought new questions and fewer answers about where this reckless crusade was headed and what might be left of him when it reached its violent crescendo. Chapter 8, Fractured Identity. Sleep refused to come easily, haunted by half-remembered images of Tyler Durden's endless projects and the unblinking stares of the Paper Street recruits. The narrator felt he was losing his grip on where his life began, and Tyler's grand design ended. Even more troubling were the strange gaps in the narrator's memory. Late-night phone calls he couldn't recall making. Vivid dreams where he was talking, no, barking orders, to men in different cities. Awaking in his bed, disoriented, he would check the clock to discover hours had passed unaccounted for, his heart thumping with nameless dread. Tyler was rarely around anymore. He'd vanished for days at a stretch, leaving behind only cryptic notes or murmurs that he was off orchestrating missions in other cities. The narrator scoured the Paper Street house for answers. In the living room, among piles of battered furniture and half-completed Project Mayhem checklists, he found paper scraps covered in Tyler's scrawled handwriting. Addresses, phone numbers, single words like arson, recruitment, or finances. Each piece hinted at a far-reaching operation that dwarfed any single basement fight club. The narrator tried calling these numbers, searching for Tyler. He dialed a phone in Seattle and heard Wait, do you know where Tyler is? Silence. Then, almost in a tone of disbelief, this is Tyler Durden. And then the line clicked dead. He called another number in Chicago. The same thing happened. A moment of recognition, hushed awe, and then an abrupt disconnect. It made no sense. In growing panic, the narrator realized that every time he introduced himself as searching for Tyler Durden, they treated him like he was Tyler Durden. The final phone call unsettled him most of all. He heard his own voice on the other end, or something that sounded eerily close to it, reciting instructions he didn't remember giving. He slammed the receiver down, heart pounding. Am I losing it? Marla Singer became an unexpected source of both frustration and uneasy insight. On more than one occasion, she cornered the narrator in a hallway or outside the house, hurling accusations about the things he had told her. Don't you remember what you said to me last night? She demanded one morning, gaze smoldering with anger. What are you talking about? He shot back, genuinely baffled. I haven't seen you in days. Marla's expression darkened, as if suspecting a cruel joke. Cut the act, she snapped. You called me in the middle of the night, said all these things, and now you're pretending it never happened. You're sick, you know that. Worse still, some nights the narrator awoke to find Marla asleep in Tyler's bed, or perhaps rummaging through the kitchen while the rest of the house dozed. She'd glare at him, accusing him of contradictory behavior. You told me to leave, and now you say it's okay for me to stay. Make up your mind. He was speechless. When had he told her to stay or to leave? In those moments, a flicker of memory would surface, an image of himself pacing in the kitchen at 3 a.m., speaking in Tyler's confident drawl. Then it vanished, leaving him dizzy and nauseous. He became consumed with uncovering the truth. What was happening during these blank stretches in his memory? Why did half the men in the house treat him with deferential awe, while the others claimed Tyler was simply out of town? Trying to pin down details felt like chasing ghosts. One evening, after prowling through the labyrinth of cots and bunk beds, the narrator finally cornered a newcomer, someone who hadn't yet been trained to stonewall. Where is Tyler Durden? The narrator asked, voice tight with desperation. The recruit blinked, clearly confused. Sir, you gave the last orders yourself, he said softly. We figured you had everything under control. Unable to bear the swirling confusion, the narrator fled the paper street house. He roamed city streets, past half-lit store windows and flickering neon signs, searching for something to ground him. Eventually, he found himself at one of the original Fight Club locations, a cramped bar basement with the familiar chalky smell of concrete and sweat. Stepping inside, he discovered a group of men finishing a nightly fight session. They froze, turning their battered faces in his direction. A hush spread, and he felt their eyes lock onto him in that same reverential way. One man stepped forward, bruised but resolute. We did what you asked, Tyler. We're ready for the next assignment. The narrator's stomach dropped. I'm not... His words faltered. Tell me what you think you know. The man looked puzzled. You're Tyler Durden. You started all of this. That night was a blur, a maelstrom of fear and self-doubt. He stumbled through an alley, hearing the distant hum of traffic and the thrumming of his own heart, trying to wrap his mind around what everyone was saying. If they believed he was Tyler Durden, but he believed Tyler was someone else entirely, how could both be true? Could Tyler be? No, that's impossible. His mind resisted the notion, but the puzzle pieces slotted together with horrifying simplicity. The blackouts, the phone calls he couldn't remember, the voice on the other end of the line that sometimes sounded like his own. The new recruits who called him sir, even when Tyler was supposedly out of town. Every clue pointed to the same overtook him in stuttering fragments. Visions darted in and out of his subconscious. He was the one lighting the fuse on a makeshift bomb. He was the one pulling Marla into late-night conversations. He was the one forging documents in the Paper Street basement. And in these visions, Tyler's face and his own face began to blur together. He saw Tyler, spiky-haired and grinning. Then, in the dream's reflection, it wasn't Tyler, but the narrator himself, wearing that same feral smile. He jolted awake. The morning light crept through a threadbare curtain, illuminating a silent, grimy room. The phone by the bed rang, jarring him from his thoughts. He picked it up hesitantly. "Tyler," a voice asked. It felt like a noose tightening around his neck. The narrator mustered a response. "This isn't Tyler," he whispered, half believing it. But the other person gave a short, awkward laugh, as if a beloved joke had been repeated. "Sure it is," the caller said. "We have everything set for tonight. Just need your go-ahead." A wave of nausea rolled over him. He slammed the phone down. Questions stormed through his mind. How did this happen? He remembered the desperation of his old life, his insomnia, the aimless consumption of catalogs, his longing for escape. Tyler Durden had seemed to materialize from nowhere, brimming with confidence, the perfect antidote to the narrator's soul-crushing routine. Had I invented him from pure need? The line between external friend and internal projection was so blurred now, it was nearly impossible to see where one ended and the other began. What if he was always me, or I was always him? In a surge of panic, the narrator tore open his wallet and stared at his driver's license. The name felt meaningless. He turned over receipts and business cards, searching for any official proof that he wasn't insane. But all he found were contradictory notes scrawled by Tyler Durden, items that seemed to come from his own pockets. With trembling hands, he sank onto the motel bed. He felt as though the world had slipped off its axis. "I am Tyler Durden," he repeated silently, testing the words' weight, feeling them reverberate through his bones. He spent the rest of the day stumbling around the motel, curtains drawn, trying to piece together a life that suddenly felt like a lie. Tyler's voice echoed in his head. "You were looking for a way to change your life, but you couldn't do it on your own." That voice was now inseparable from his own. "I created you," the narrator thought, and yet it was equally true that Tyler had created him, remaking the narrator in Tyler's fearless image. It was a paradox that threatened to crush his sanity. By nightfall, he resolved to return to the Paper Street house, uncertain what he would do once there. But he couldn't hide from the truth forever. If he and Tyler were the same person, then every plot, every act of sabotage, every word spoken to those recruits had come from him. And Project Mayhem, in all its unsettling glory, was his responsibility. The mere thought chilled him, yet beneath the fear lay a flicker of determination. "If I started this, I can end it, somehow." He slipped out of the motel and into the hazy street, an uneasy calm settling over him. The foundation of his identity had crumbled, revealing a dark, chaotic underbelly. Tyler Durden was not his friend, not a separate entity. Tyler Durden was the narrator's own unleashed shadow, a part of himself that yearned to tear down every facade and rebuild the world from its rubble. As he made his way back to the house, the narrator tried to swallow the lump of terror in his throat. "We are the same," he told himself. Now he had to face the consequences of that horrifying, electrifying truth, and figure out if there was any way left to stop the juggernaut that he and Tyler had set in motion. Chapter 9. Attempting to stop Project Mayhem. By the time the narrator returned to the Paper Street house, the truth weighed on him past assignments. The yard was littered with tools, sheets of plywood, and odd contraptions that looked half-finished. From an upstairs window, light flickered erratically, as if someone were tinkering with electrical circuits. As he slipped inside, the narrator noticed the once cramped foyer had been converted into a sort of command center. Pinned maps, lists of potential targets, photographs of financial buildings and corporate headquarters. The men who recognized him saluted with polite nods or murmured, "Good evening, sir." He forced a stiff reply each time, scanning their faces for any sign they sensed a change in him. Some crack in his facade now that he understood the impossible truth. Yet their expressions remained dutiful, respectful. It chilled him. So many had forsaken their old lives for the cause that Tyler had promised. And the real Tyler, the narrator, could no longer ignore the consequences. Over the next few days, the narrator launched a desperate campaign to dismantle the sprawling network he'd helped create. He found scribbled notes in closets and under mattresses, detailing elaborate sabotage efforts, stolen explosives, carefully planned demolition times, exact building coordinates. He tore these notes apart and tossed them in trash bins, frantically hoping it would slow down the next wave of chaos. Whenever he confronted a Project Mayhem recruit, insisting that the mission be called off, he got a polite but firm refusal. "We don't take orders from you to halt Project Mayhem, sir," one of them said stoically. "We take orders from Tyler Durden." Anger flared, but He caught himself before finishing that sentence, unsettled by the logic trap. If he admitted that he was Tyler, they would only press him for further commands. And if he swore he wasn't Tyler, they would ignore him. He was trapped in his own twisted riddle. Worse, the phone rang at odd hours. When he answered, men from other cities reported new successes. Office towers blacked out, corporate artworks desecrated, high-end cars destroyed. Some insisted on speaking with Tyler Durden personally, but the narrator could barely stammer a response before they hung up, as if the mere sound of his voice confirmed they were on the right track. I need to stop this, but it's spreading everywhere. Increasingly frantic, he rummaged through every drawer and desk in the Paper Street house, searching for a master plan or a list of directives that would reveal the full scope of Project Mayhem's missions. It was a surreal scavenger hunt. In the dimly lit basement, where the original Fight Club had been held, he discovered dusty notebooks containing half-finished sketches of urban streets. They marked potential targets in swirling red ink. Some entries bore partial instructions on how to create more advanced explosives. Others included coded references to getaways and safe houses. The narrator's skin crawled. We're on the brink of something catastrophic, he realized, and it's my own split psyche that orchestrated it all. One evening, he confronted a high-ranking member, a hulking man with bruises that never seemed to heal, who oversaw new recruits. "Listen," the narrator said, voice low and urgent. "I want you to stand down. Cancel the assignments this week. That's a direct order." The man regarded him with a puzzled tilt of the head. "We only follow the orders Tyler left us, sir," he replied in a monotone. "If you want them canceled, you'll need to talk to Tyler." "Don't you see?" The narrator seethed, teeth clenched. "He's not coming back. I'm telling you, as your leader, these tasks are over." But the man simply repeated, "If Tyler said so, then so it is. We haven't heard Tyler say we're done." Feeling the walls close in, the narrator realized the futility of trying to reason with these men. To them, I'm a stand-in. The real Tyler is some mythic figure. And though the narrator was Tyler in a literal, psychological sense, the recruits didn't accept that nuance. Their unwavering devotion was to the unstoppable icon of Tyler Durden, not the trembling man trying to rein in an out-of-control revolution. Beset by sleepless sleepless nights again, the narrator booked a series of whirlwind flights, hoping he could outrun Tyler's influence by confronting the branches of Project Mayhem in person. He traveled to major cities, Chicago, Seattle, New York, where underground fight clubs had metastasized into paramilitary cells. Each time, it was the same. Men recognized him, addressed him as Tyler Durden, saluted him, and showed him the progress of their elaborate pranks or sabotage efforts. When he demanded they cease operations, they exchanged confused glances, as if they couldn't understand why Tyler would want to derail his own blueprint. In Chicago, he stumbled onto a warehouse on the outskirts of town. Inside, men loaded crates labeled with obscure codes onto trucks. "It's for the final move," one recruit explained proudly, Tyler's master stroke. The narrator pried open a box and found homemade explosives. He wrestled one out, eyes wide with horror at the quantity. "Where do these go?" he demanded. "Banks, data centers, wherever Tyler told us," the recruit answered, shrugging. In helpless fury, the narrator tried to dismantle a device on the spot, but the men wrestled it away, worried he'd cause an accidental detonation. They offered gentle apologies, as if refusing to let a beloved but momentarily confused leader sabotage his own plan. After each failed intervention, the narrator felt the suffocating weight of inevitability. Tyler Durden's grand scheme had become a series of unstoppable dominoes. Even if some missions were thwarted, countless others would keep rolling out, fueled by the unwavering loyalty of hundreds, maybe thousands of followers. "This is bigger than me, bigger than us," he thought grimly. Tyler's too far ahead. Yet a flicker of resolve refused to die. He thought of Marla Singer, who had once accused him of running a cult. She was right, the narrator conceded. But maybe she's the only real link to my old self, the only person who saw me, not just Tyler. He tried calling her from random payphones. Sometimes she answered, sometimes she didn't. He left frantic messages. "Don't trust what I told you before. It wasn't me. I mean, it was me, but..." The voicemails trailed off into strained silence, sounding deranged even to his own ears. Eventually, he tracked her down at a dingy hotel on the outskirts of town, where she'd holed up after yet another fight with him, or Tyler, or both. She opened the door a crack, letting out a cloud of stale cigarette smoke. Her eyes, rimmed with smudged eyeliner, flickered with wary anger. "What do you want?" she hissed. "I need help," he admitted, sagging with defeat. "I can't stop what's happening alone. Tyler's..." She rolled her eyes. "You are Tyler, right?" He shook his head. "Yes, and no. It's complicated. But I need you to believe me. I'm trying to fix this. It's gotten out of hand." Marla stared at him for a long moment, then stepped aside, letting him in. Their conversation bled into the early hours of morning, with the narrator stumbling through the impossible explanation of his split psyche and Project Mayhem's unstoppable momentum. Marla was skeptical, furious, and yet strangely sympathetic. "I told you this was a bad idea," she said flatly, lighting yet another cigarette. "But if you really want to stop it, how do you plan on doing that?" He had no immediate answer. Maybe it's already too late. After a heavy silence, Marla lifted the phone in the hotel room and dialed a number. "The hospital downtown has a psych ward," she muttered. "You might need professional help." He nearly protested, but realized she might be right. The lines of reality had blurred so thoroughly that perhaps he required outside intervention. But would any doctor believe his story of an alter ego commanding an army of disaffected men? Before they could finalize any plan, a knock sounded at the door. The narrator's blood ran cold. He found a group of Project Mayhem foot soldiers in the hallway, wearing blank expressions. "We've come to check on Tyler," one explained, scanning the space with cool, appraising eyes. "Is everything all right?" Terror seized him. "They followed me here." Marla, taken aback, demanded answers, but the men ignored her, focusing solely on the narrator. "Sir, we have urgent news," said another. "The final phase is nearly ready in our city. We need your authorization. Without you, the mission is incomplete." The narrator let out a shaky breath, stepping into the corridor while Marla stood in the background, arms crossed, worry etched on her face. "Maybe if I go with them, I can sabotage the final step." Shaken yet grimly resolved, he nodded. "Okay," he said, "but let's talk about it first." The recruits led him away with silent efficiency, as if he were a prized asset suddenly recovered. Marla shouted after him, "Don't let them brainwash you again." He didn't respond, uncertain if it was already too late. As they guided him into a waiting car, the narrator felt dread coiling tighter in his chest. He had unleashed Project Mayhem, and now it lived independent of his will, almost a living organism that recognized him as both father and figurehead. He'd tried to shut it down from within, but each new revelation only revealed a deeper layer of planning he'd set in motion during Tyler's active hours. The city, and possibly others, lay on the brink of large-scale destruction. Yet beneath the despair flickered a raw determination. "This is my doing," he thought. "I have to end it." Whether or not he could actually succeed against a network devoted to his own alter ego was another question entirely. Clenching his fists, he braced for whatever came next, aware that he was running out of time, and that Tyler Durden, unstoppable as he seemed, was inescapably part of himself. Chapter 10. The Final Showdown. Hurtling through the dark streets, headlights cutting a swath across deserted intersections, the narrator found himself in the back seat of a sedan packed with Project Mayhem recruits. City lights flickered past, washing over the men's impassive faces. Each time they spoke to him, they used the same respectful address. "Yes, sir." "Right away, sir." Yet their politeness only amplified his dread. The obedient monotone hinted that the destructive mission he'd helped set in motion was nearing its pinnacle. Once they reached a nearly vacant parking garage in the financial district, the car rattled to a stop. The narrator's stomach churned. He recognized the location from the plans he'd discovered in the Paper Street house, one of the targets for Project Mayhem's final assault. A tall building loomed overhead, all glass and steel, lit by harsh floodlights. Somewhere deep inside that structure, an entire network of credit records was stored, files that, if destroyed, would disrupt financial systems for years. The men ushered him out of the car and up several flights of concrete ramps. Finally, on the topmost level, they arrived at a barricaded area filled with crates of equipment. The narrator's heart pounded at the sight of bundles of homemade explosives wired to cell phones or crude timers. He remembered planning all of this, or rather, Tyler had planned it, yet the memory flickered in and out of his consciousness like a half-formed dream. "Sir, we're ahead of schedule," reported one of the recruits, a muscular man with a freshly shaved head and a ragged bandage on his forearm. "All that's left is to activate the timers." The narrator forced himself to speak, trying to feign Tyler's authority. "I need to inspect everything first," he said, stepping forward. "You did well, but we can't proceed until I say so." A ripple of uncertainty passed through the men. One recruit, brows knitted, began to say, but Tyler gave explicit orders. "Yes," the narrator interjected, "and here I am to ensure those orders are carried out correctly. No mistakes." He moved among the crates, his gaze fixed on the tangled wires and blocks of explosive hidden beneath camouflage tarps. If he could disarm them, cut the right cord, pull out the blasting caps, maybe he could avert this catastrophe. But one glance at the complicated circuitry told him it wouldn't be so simple. The bombs were all interconnected, part of a daisy-chain design. Tampering with one device without the right knowledge could trigger the entire load prematurely, destroying both the building and everyone on the top floor. Before he could settle on a plan, footsteps echoed across the concrete. The recruits stood at attention. The narrator spun around to see Tyler Durden, his own face, but with that wild, confident grin, emerging from the shadows. He wore a fitted leather jacket spattered with paint and dust, his eyes alight with a triumphant gleam. The narrator's knees nearly buckled at the sight. Am I really seeing him? Am I imagining this? Or is it all in my head? Tyler strolled forward, offering a curt nod to the recruits. They relaxed slightly, as if comforted by the presence of their true leader. Well, well, Tyler drawled, focusing his attention on the narrator. You've been busy, trying to sabotage our little party, but you know what? He spread his arms wide. You can't stop something you started in the first place. A ripple of confusion crossed the men's faces. They're seeing both of us. Or at least, they think they do, the narrator realized with a faint sense of horror. Is my body standing here talking to itself? He didn't have time to dwell on it. Tyler beckoned him closer, stepping away from the group and into the far corner of the rooftop. The narrator followed, heart hammering. I'm the one who set this all up, Tyler said, his voice low, conspiratorial. We are so close to tearing down the system. These fat cat banks will lose everything. The corporations will be set back by decades. Imagine the freedom that brings for everyone. Freedom, the narrator echoed, eyes flicking to the bombs. You're going to kill innocent people. Kill them, Tyler scoffed. We evacuated the building. Project Mayhem has its code. We don't murder, we set things free. Removing debt, erasing the ledgers. This is the reset button society needs. Hearing Tyler articulate that made the narrator shudder. He could almost see the terrible logic behind it, the twisted utopia of wiping the slate clean. But in that clarity, he saw just how dangerous the fantasy was. No, I won't let you do this, he insisted, voice trembling. You can't keep hijacking my body, my mind, for your crusade. This ends now. Tyler's grin faltered. His eyes locked with the narrator's, brimming with both challenge and a flicker of disappointment. You were the one who wanted to change your life, remember? I only existed because you were too afraid to seize the world by the throat. You conjured me. Now you want to go back to sleep. The words struck deep, dredging up memories of the narrator's old insomnia, his dissatisfaction, his longing for something real. I need to fix the damage, he whispered. I accept that you're part of me, but it can't go on like this. Tyler sighed dramatically, then spun on his heel. Fellas, he called to the assembled men. Give us a moment. Your fearless leader and I need to talk. The recruits exchanged uncertain looks, then took the elevator down, leaving the narrator and Tyler alone on the garage roof, bombs ticking away in the background. An eerie silence fell, punctuated only by the hiss of wind across the concrete. Tyler turned back, his expression dangerous. Are you prepared to face what it means to destroy me? Because if you kill me, you kill part of yourself. You'll be walking around half empty. Better that, the narrator said, voice quavering. Then stand by and watch more destruction. And then, Tyler lunged. A fist crashed into the narrator's jaw. Pain blossomed, bright and all-consuming. The narrator staggered, tasting blood. This fight was different from their earlier brawls, which had been about catharsis and release. This time, they were battling for the narrator's very identity and the fate of a city. Tyler unleashed a flurry of blows, brutal and efficient. The narrator tried to defend himself, but every move Tyler made felt like the sharper edge of the same blade. How do I fight something that's me? Stumbling backward, the narrator slammed against a metal support beam. Tyler advanced, face contorted with fury. "I gave you a new life," he hissed. "I showed you how to feel alive again, and this is how you repay me." The narrator managed a battered grin. "You gave me a life that isn't mine," he croaked. "I'm taking it back." Summoning a burst of desperate resolve, he launched himself at Tyler, grappling him around the torso. They toppled to the concrete floor, trading bruising hits. Tyler snarled, trying to pin the narrator's arms, but the narrator twisted free, ignoring the searing pain in his ribs. In a flash of insight, the narrator recognized that physically defeating Tyler might not be enough. "He's in my mind. I have to break that hold mentally." Mustering every ounce of will, he wrapped one hand around Tyler's throat, just as Tyler had taught him in so many basement fights, and squeezed. Tyler's eyes went wide, and his lips curled into a chilling smile, even as he choked. "Go ahead," he rasped. "Kill me. Kill yourself." For a moment, the narrator's hand trembled. He couldn't do it, couldn't end himself, not this way. Then another idea sparked. Releasing Tyler, he scrabbled across the concrete until he found a discarded handgun, one of the items Project Mayhem had stashed in case things went sideways. Tyler looked both amused and curious as the narrator leveled the pistol at his own temple. "Now wait," Tyler started, his grin faltering. The narrator's heart pounded. "This is me. Tyler is me." He needed a symbolic act that severed Tyler's control. With a final ragged breath, he pulled the trigger, not to blow out his brains, but to graze the side of his face, an intentional half measure. The deafening blast tore through his eardrums. Agony erupted along his cheek. The shockwave knocked him backward, and he collapsed onto the concrete, dizzy and blinded by pain. When his vision cleared, Tyler was gone. The narrator's face throbbed, warm blood trickling down his neck, but there was no sign of his alter ego. Just empty space, the bombs quietly ticking in the corner. I did it. Somehow, that violent gesture had ripped Tyler's hold free from his mind, at least for the moment. He crawled to the nearest device, blood streaking his shirt. The timers flashed ominously. Maybe it was too late to disarm all of them, but if the building was fully evacuated, the final catastrophe might only demolish the structure and disrupt the financial system, as Tyler had planned, without costing lives. A creeping sense of relief and dread washed over him. This is how it ends. Just then, the elevator doors opened. A figure emerged, Marla Singer, disheveled and out of breath. She'd followed him, refusing to let Project Mayhem snatch him away without a fight. Her eyes widened at the sight of the narrator sprawled in blood, a gun in hand. For a second, she looked terrified he might turn it on her. "Oh my God, what have you done?" she gasped. "I had to. Stop him. Stop me," he whispered, letting the gun slip from his grasp. "It's over." They clung to each other, uncertain whether the building was about to explode or stand. Far below, sirens wailed. Police or emergency crews, maybe tipped off to the threat. Everything was chaos, but in the midst of it, the narrator felt a fragile calm. Tyler Durden was gone. Or if he isn't fully gone, he thought, he's at least silent now. In Chuck Palahniuk's novel and the film adaptation, the final moments vary slightly. But in this retelling, the narrator's decisive act of self-confrontation severs Tyler's hold. He stands on the brink of a new beginning, bruised, bloodied, half hallucinating from the pain. Perhaps the bombs will detonate, reshaping the skyline, or perhaps they'll be disarmed by arriving authorities. Either way, the narrator remains alive, free from Tyler's voice for the first time in what feels like an eternity. He looks at Marla, exhausted, shaken, but still there, and realizes he might not have to face the aftermath alone. In the distance, sirens grow louder. The city might be changed forever, or maybe life will stagger on as usual. For the narrator, though, the real impact lies within. He has wrestled his own shadow and come out the other side, wounded but undeniably whole. The curtains on his old life close amid chaos and debris, yet a faint light of possibility, of truly living as himself, begins to dawn.